21 years. That's how long fans have been waiting for a new entry in Sega's cult classic Jet Set Radio series. Besides the original Jet Set Radio on Sega's Dreamcast in 2000, known as Jet Grind Radio here in the States, the only other main entry in the series is Jet Set Radio Future. This follow-up was released on the Xbox 2 years prior to the original, but most would call this a reimagining of the first game rather than a true, proper sequel. With that being said, I'm sure you can imagine the amount of excitement that any semblance of a new entry in the series would get after such a long wait, and while Sega has been unwilling to greenlight anything new for the Jet Set Radio series up until very recently, that certainly didn't stop Team Reptile from making their own interpretation with Bomb Rush Cyberfunk, and fans were hyped. In the early 2000s, video games based on action sports were everywhere. From the Tony Hawk series and its mini spin-offs to some of the weirder releases like Airblade and Freakstyle, the genre was inescapable. For the uninitiated, action sports, known back then as extreme sports, were a set of loosely related activities that focused far less on the competitive side of traditional sports and instead heavily emphasized the athlete's individual freedom, creativity, and expression. Among the likes of skateboarding, BMX, aggressive inline, snowboarding, motocross, etc., action sports encompassed pretty much everything you might find present at the X Games. These sports were also directly aligned with and influenced the alternative culture of the time, weaving their way into the likes of street art, punk music, fashion, and really anything else that challenged the status quo. All of these aspects made action sports the perfect pairing for video games, and with all of the creativity these sports could lend to the medium, you'd think it'd be nearly impossible to stand out. Yet of course, that's exactly what Jet Set Radio did. While other games in the genre were mostly concerned with going with more realistic graphics, Jet Set Radio leaned fully into Japan's alternative culture of the time and went with an over-the-top, bombastic art style with exaggerated proportions and vibrant colors. Merging graffiti and inline skating was a crucial decision that certainly helped differentiate itself from the rest of action sports games, but what really set it apart, however, was its use of cel-shading graphics. This rendering technique was used to achieve the unique cartoon-like outlines and shadowing JSR is known for, and although it wasn't the first to use this technique, it was pivotal in popularizing it, arguably influencing other titles like Okami, 13, and of course the Legend of Zelda games Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild. Jet Set Radio's charm, style, and attitude, combined with its addictive graffiti and rollerblading gameplay, eventually led to its cult classic status, and is largely why it's garnered the dedicated fan base it has today. With all that being said, let's find out if Team Reptile's Bomb Rush Cyberfunk lives up to the very high expectations us fans have set for it. The one thing Jet Set Radio is most known for, above all else, is its unmistakable art direction. Thankfully, Team Reptile's Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is no exception, and although it might not be directly tied to the series it's inspired by, it perfectly nails its style at every turn. Obviously, you can't make a Jet Set Radio successor and not make use of the iconic cel shading it's known for, so with the advantages of modern HD screens, it looks as crisp and as clean as ever. Furthering this retro aesthetic, the character models are all designed with that low-poly, boxy look of the early 2000s you'd expect, but the textures on these characters do leave a bit to be desired. I understand that the goal was to lean into the look of 6th gen consoles as much as possible, but I find the very pixelated textures clash a little bit too much with just how precise the shading and outlines of characters are. Since Bomb Rush unapologetically wears its inspiration on its sleeve, it often feels quite comforting and nostalgic. But this also means it can sometimes suffer from being pretty derivative and somewhat uninspired. Many of the locations you'll visit in BRC's New Amsterdam are direct callbacks to areas from Jet Set Radio and JSR Future's Tokyo-to. Versum Hill takes inspiration from Dogenzaka Hill, Brink Terminal is basically Shibuya Terminal, and Matan emulates aspects of 99th Street. Thankfully, there are a couple of locations that demonstrate Team Reptile's creativity when given the freedom to design original maps. Millennium Mall is a sprawling complex with tons of combo opportunities, secret areas, and charm. And then you have Pyramid Island, which is a perfect example of how vast depth using verticality can really accentuate the core gameplay as you work your way up to the top through its multiple tiers. Characters can also end up feeling somewhat rehashed, with examples like Bell and Red taking clear inspiration from Gum and Beat respectively, but in this instance, most are still easily distinguishable from the designs that inspired them. With how many facets are taken straight from the source, I was a bit disappointed not to see other characteristics make their way into Bomb Rush Cyberfunk. Speakers pulsing to the beat of the music, while admittedly a very small detail, is one that I always felt brought so much more liveliness and personality to Jet Set Radio, and it's unfortunate not to see it included here. That's not to speak down on the animations as a whole though, because what we got here is truly incredible. Everything from the movement, tricks, and dances are all very stylish with a really nice over-the-top flair to them. The dances in particular look especially good thanks to the excellent mo-capping, some of which was performed by none other than Team Reptile co-founder Dion Coster himself. While I'm not as knowledgeable about BMX and inline, as far as skateboarding is concerned, tricks are animated quite accurately and are all named correctly too, something that is strangely not always the case in video games. Beyond just the trick names, I was pleased to see characters using proper graffiti terminology and slang throughout the story, and it really goes to show just how passionate the developers are about even the smallest details. Everything Bomb Rush offers visually looks great, and because of the commitment to a retro aesthetic, it's not particularly demanding on hardware at all. The system requirements on PC only require a 2.5 GHz processor, a GTX 460, and 4 GB of RAM, meaning any remotely modern computer should have absolutely no problems running this game. Of course, while visual flair and aesthetics are a key part of what made Jet Set Radio such a huge hit, the killer soundtracks were arguably just as important, if not more so. With hits like The Concept of Love and Let Mom Sleep practically becoming monolithic anthems for their respective games, the bar is set pretty damn high for Bomb Rush Cyberfunk's soundtrack. And I have to say, Team Reptile did a perfect job of capturing the sound of that early 2000s mix of electro-funk, drum and bass, acid jazz, and dance punk. While there isn't really one singular defining song, there's definitely a few that come pretty close. My personal favorites are the aggressive and in-your-face Operator, the chill vibes of Light Switch and Condensed Milk, and the retro PlayStation style of Watch It Back. Even tracks like Hair Done, Nails Done, which I hated at first, eventually grew on me as I heard it more in the context of the game, especially with the way tracks transition into the next, like a live DJ set. The only downside to the whole track list is that there isn't a super cool pirate DJ like Professor K chatting between the mixes. It's not a huge deal, but still a small grievance nonetheless. Jet Set Radio's original composer, Hideki Naganuma, even returned to contribute the songs Jack to Funk, Get Enough, and To People, all of which hit you with his unmistakable sound. Arguably though, the best track in the game is I Wanna Know by Too Mellow, which is such a cool inclusion for diehard Jet Set Radio fans that most will have undoubtedly already realized why. Not only does it fit the vibe of the game perfectly, but the reason it fits so well is because it's taken from Too Mellow's Sounds of Tokyo To Future, the second in his pair of albums directly inspired by Jet Set Radio and Jet Set Radio Future. If you have not heard either of these yet, listen to them the next time you play this game, and I promise you will not regret it. Bomb Rush Cyberfunk's soundtrack then is the perfect companion to its gameplay, and really complements the vibrant retro visuals it accompanies. Team Reptile have managed to perfectly capture the look, feel, and sound of a bygone era with this game, while still giving it its own unique style and charm. So as far as story goes, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk sticks with a pretty tried and true narrative, not too unlike most other media based on street art that we've seen before. Graffiti crews are slowly being subjected to the brutality and surveillance state of a dystopian and overly militarized police force, and it is of course up to our main character and their crew to stop them. While this may seem pretty unoriginal on the surface, I think it still manages to keep itself campy without feeling like it's beating a dead horse. The story actually does a pretty good job of introducing its own concepts to avoid these tropes by leaning into the cyberpunk ethos of its title, giving it a pretty unique spin on the formula. Bomb Rush Cyberfunk places you in the shoes, or rather head, of Red, a robotic cyberhead that's been attached to the body of renowned street writer Foe, whose own head was lost during the tutorial section's prison break. This opening tutorial was definitely a bit on the long side, especially once it's finished and you still have minutes of exposition dialogue to get through when all I really wanted to do was explore. That's not to say the story bored me or anything, but the last thing I wanted to do after waiting so long for a game like this is to spend time reading text boxes. That issue aside, the main narrative centers around Red trying to uncover his body's former life so he can reach his full potential as a writer and help the titular Bomb Rush crew go all city. Naturally, that won't be easy, as to do so will require them to battle the aforementioned corrupt police force, while also taking out overzealous and sometimes downright antagonistic rival crews. Throughout the game, there are 5 of these rival crews, corresponding to one of the game's 5 boroughs that they control. Each crew has its own unique style, like Versum Hill's Franks being basketball-loving amalgamations of body parts, headed by the aptly named Flesh Prince. Other examples are Millennium Mall's crew .exe, who all wear striped tracksuits and have billiards-themed cyberheads, or Matan's Futurism, who have certainly chosen a look, and are ruled by the antagonist who rid Foe's body of his head, DJ Cyber. As you defeat these crews, you can recruit some of their members, as well as other taggers you might come across, into your crew. While most of them boil down to completing simple score challenges to impress them, some of them actually had some creative objectives, like Shine, who just enjoys vibing and sends you these vague text of her whereabouts for you to find her and match her dance moves. And then there's Mesh, who asks you to help him drain a dam to get back the skateboard he clumsily dropped into it, which not only adds him to the team, but opens up a new area for you to ride as well. As you unlock new characters, you can switch to them by initiating a cipher at one of the various dance pads scattered throughout the levels. Something that was quite jarring about the first time I did one of these was the fact that the DLC characters just show up to the cipher with no explanation as to why they're there. Considering I'd forgotten that I had even purchased the deluxe edition, this definitely confused the hell out of me for a moment. Apart from these characters and crews, there's also the old heads who have long since put down their paint cans and inlines and now oversee the unwritten codes of the streets, while also being the mediators and judges of crew battles. I kinda just love these guys' quirky attitudes and designs. Plus, it's especially satisfying finishing a battle and hearing Classic's robotic "yo" signifying your victory. These crew battles tie back to the main story, as every time you win one of these battles, it unlocks a core memory of Red's past that unfortunately has the side effect of knocking him out and sending him into a dream state. The aesthetic of these liminal locations is super cool, with the way lighting is significantly altered while objects and obstacles float around in space. Each one serves as a nice change of pace that slowly builds up the narrative while piecing together how Foe, Red, DJ Cyber, and this new police force are all interconnected. Overall, for a game of this genre, I'd say it's actually a pretty well-written story and is more than serviceable at providing motivation to progress through the game. Whenever I go back to the original Jet Set Radio, one of the negatives I'm always immediately reminded of is just how frustrating the controls could be at times. While its sequel, Jet Set Radio Future, did vastly improve the handling and ironed out the majority of issues the original had, it still didn't control perfectly either. I'm happy to say that Bomb Rush Cyberfunk does not suffer from the sins of the past, and instead is jet grinding Bliss, taking its gameplay inspiration mostly from the improvements made in JSR Future and perfecting them. The addition of slides, manuals, and inverted grinds, on top of the inclusion of BMX, skateboarding, and freerunning, further fleshes out the mechanics and brings some much needed depth to the gameplay. While the new rides, known as move styles, certainly look different, they all function and control completely identical to the traditional inline skates, and really only differ in one specific use for each. Tricks for these move styles can be performed while grinding, on flat ground, or in the air using one of the 3 face buttons, and then further modified using the boost pack to perform special tricks. All of this can then be used with manuals and slides to link tricks together and create combos. Now, it's nowhere near the level of complexity seen in the likes of the Tony Hawk games, however, so only having 3 moves for each type can definitely leave it lacking in variety. A small detail that was omitted in this game, though, is the ability for inlines to skate backwards. This applies to BMX too, and similarly, skateboarding is locked to just regular stance, with no option for goofy skaters. This isn't a game-ruining issue by any means, and while I've skated regular myself, I'm sure there are many players who would have felt a bit more comfortable being able to choose their preferred stance. Something that was sorely missing from the Jet Set series is the ability to unequip your ride, which you can do at any time by pressing the left bumper, allowing for much greater precision in character movement. Combining this with jumps that are less floaty and have greater in-air controls allows the platforming side of the gameplay to flourish and prevents any of those awkward situations where you land on a tight spot and end up rolling off the edge. Much like what manuals did for the Tony Hawk series, the addition of set slides and manuals here is absolutely transformative to the way you create and maintain combos. Once again though, this is going to differ greatly from the way it functions compared to the Birdman's games. Since there's no balance meter, manuals instead have a timer that can only be reset by grinding, wall riding, airing off a ramp, or using a boosted trick. Because balance meters are also absent for grinds, it leads to combos feeling more like puzzles rather than a test of your raw ability with the mechanics. Achieving high scores requires you to increase the point value by cycling through the different tricks while also increasing the multiplier, which can only be done by leaning into grinds through corners, getting air off quarter pipes, or wall riding billboards. The way this alters combos into puzzle-like challenges is that these corners, ramps, and billboards only grant additional multipliers the first time they're used, requiring the path of the combo to be carefully thought out ahead of time in order to maximize the multiplier. I found this new way of performing combos to be extremely satisfying, and it appears the developers were more than aware of this too. Each of the game's locations have an achievement for beating a ridiculously high score combo, which will demand complete mastery and knowledge of each location if you ever hope to get them. There's also the combo robots scattered throughout the game that require you to high-five each one in a single line, not too dissimilar to Tony Hawk's combo challenges. With so much at play here to master, I appreciate the devs not wanting to overwhelm the player by explaining too much of these mechanics immediately, but the pace at which some of the tutorials are doled out can render them pretty redundant by the time they're finally explained. I can recall a few times where I became frustrated and looked up how to perform a certain task, like sliding pads for free running, only for the game to finally inform me about them a few missions later. Small gripes aside though, all of this ties into Bomb Rush Cyberfunk's core gameplay device: exploration. Everything from the combo challenges to the layout of the locations are designed to encourage discovering as many different opportunities to traverse the levels as possible. The first area of Versum Hill has some elevated tagging opportunities that are visible as soon as you load in, but figuring out how to reach them is a fun challenge in itself. Exploration is also heavily rewarded in the form of finding alternative outfits for characters, colors for rides, new graffiti pieces, and all of the individual songs off the soundtrack. The different move styles can also provide unique opportunities for traversal, but unfortunately these all ended up feeling rather shallow and only amount to one single ability for each. The BMX unlocks a specific type of door, inlines break glass floors, and skateboards use nada spins on red poles to reach higher locations. Considering you never know when you might come across one of these move style specific locations, it sucks not being able to swap to different rides on the fly with a selector wheel similar to Grand Theft Auto's. Instead, the only option to exchange rides is by traveling all the way back to the Bomb Rush crew's hideout. To avoid this, you can also initiate one of the ciphers I mentioned earlier and switch to a character that already has the desired ride equipped. Besides the singular uses for each ride, there's not much reason to switch move styles apart from aesthetic, and I feel like giving each one more individual applications would have gone a long way. Regardless, the small but unique abilities each move style does offer played their part well in emphasizing the game's focus on discovery. Thankfully, in the spirit of this, Team Reptile have decided to forego including a timer, something I always found to be unnecessarily restrictive in the Jet Set titles. This allows exploration to flow much more naturally when the player isn't expecting to replay a level multiple times just to see everything. Being able to roam freely at my own pace allowed me to really get a grasp on new areas before directly jumping into challenges. The game world is split up into 5 distinct boroughs, all connected by a central hub location as well as the Bomb Rush crew's hideout, making for 7 locations total. While the latter 2 are relatively small, the 5 main boroughs are astonishingly expansive and offer up far more than initially meets the eye. At first, you'll only have a small portion of the level unlocked, but as you make progress by completing challenges and tagging spots, more areas start to open up to you. It was kind of mind-blowing stumbling across an entirely new section after thinking I had seen everything there was. One example that sticks out to me is having the main story almost finished when I realized there was an entire underground bazaar in Versum Hill that I had somehow managed to miss every time I was in the area. Much like with its visuals, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk takes inspiration from gaming's 6th generation with the way it handles secrets. None of the collectibles are marked on the map, which ensures they remain truly secret, reminding me of a time before checklist open worlds and completion percentages. I always found it exciting to finish a game and unlock a character or item that I had no idea even existed, since I didn't have a completion checklist spoiling the surprise. Since release, the game has been updated to show the number of collectibles obtained out of the total number in each area, and while this does go against what I initially liked about secrets in this game, I do think it finds a way to balance nicely between being informative enough for completionists without ruining the fun of discovering the types of collectibles or where they are. In contrast, the whereabouts of all the graffiti will be shown to you, but only after you've completed the area's crew battle and found the hidden map for each respective burrow. But even this isn't a simple, straightforward solution, because although you might know where the tags are located, figuring out how to get to them is still half the challenge. Once you make your way to a tag, throwing one up is quite intuitive, with the way controls emulate the act of spray painting fairly well, without becoming too complicated and ruining the game's arcade feel. Graffiti pieces come in 4 different sizes and require you to move the analog stick to each point on a given diagram. Small tags are put up automatically when you press the right bumper, while medium, large, and extra large have 4, 5, and 6 points respectively. I quite like this system, since you no longer have to select which tags you want to equip and can instead have your entire arsenal at all times. This does mean towards the start of the game though, you'll be putting up the same pieces over and over again, but as you discover and unlock more and more of them, you'll quickly reach the point where you have too many to even remember. The only real drawback to this new method of tagging spots is that it takes you completely out of the gameplay, which usually isn't a huge deal, but it does lead to some pretty disorienting moments as you regain control. Jet Set Radio Future had tried to remedy this by having the action assigned to a button that's simply held as you skate by a spot, but this never really worked consistently and often left gaps in the artwork that would require backtracking to fill in. Honestly, Bomb Rush's issue here could probably just be resolved by adding a short, 1-second long camera pan that reorients the player after completing a piece. Apart from this minor drawback, I do love the way tagging has been implemented here, and once again, it also does a fantastic job at propping up the game's heavy focus on exploration. When first entering new areas, I tend to look for as many graffiti spots as possible, which really helps when mentally mapping out the level before trying to tackle any of the missions. But that's not the only reason to hit all the spots immediately, as eventually, after completing enough missions, you'll draw some pretty unwanted attention. This is why I always made graffiti my first priority, as trying to deal with the constant barrage of police interference while still trying to throw up a piece could be quite annoying. Once police have been called to an area, it basically only takes 1 tag each to escalate to the next of 6 distinct heat levels. Each of these star levels have a unique enemy type it introduces, on top of the previous levels. Stages 1, 3, and 4 dispatch light enemies like grunts with batons, firearms, shields, and snipers, while star levels 2, 5, and 6 add heavy enemies to the mix in the form of stationary chain turrets, helicopters, and full-on mech tank walkers. The 3 smaller enemy types can be dealt with pretty easily by using one of the 3 different face button attacks, while the larger 3 will require regular attacks combined with spray painting to put them out of commission. Strangely enough, the turrets are the only enemy that can be completely disabled. The tank walkers and helicopters can be eliminated, but new ones will eventually take their place. However, because the turrets are in fixed locations, you can destroy them and they will stay that way until you leave the burrow. The ground personnel are easily the most annoying though, as you can spray them to slow them down and use your attacks to make them retreat, but replacements get sent out almost immediately. Combat in general is honestly pretty lacking, and I get that the goal is to encourage the player to avoid it rather than taking it head on, but that makes its introduction in the tutorial all the more confusing. During the opening tutorial mission, the game has you fight a group of enemies and their leader in an enclosed parking lot. There's nowhere for you to run, so you have to take them head on, and it gives the wrong impression about how combat is actually implemented. What I think would have worked better is finding a way to work combat into combos, maybe by having a button modifier that turns tricks into attacks. That way there would be an incentive to actually take on enemies rather than running from them and sacrificing a high score. Since boss fights naturally become the central focus whenever battling them, combat during these is actually a bit more enjoyable. That's not to say it's great, as some awkward controls and shoddy camera work leave a bit to be desired, but it's certainly an improvement over the way conflicts normally play out. Once you've had enough of fighting and running, and trust me, you will, the only way to lose heat is by going to one of the many porta potties scattered throughout to change outfits. Something I do appreciate about these is that you can change into the same outfit you're already wearing and still lose the heat, because I would hate to have finally unlocked a look I like just to immediately switch out of it as a result of tagging a couple of walls. This overzealous police system led me to getting into a bit of a groove where I tag a few spots, rush to a toilet, change outfits, and repeat, which does seem to be the intended gameplay loop, but is one that I never found to be particularly satisfying. Overall, the combat is something that I only ever engaged with when necessary, and spent the rest of my time avoiding it whenever possible. Thankfully, in contrast, the movement, tagging, and exploration are all an absolute blast to experience, and display what I loved most about this game. Although it occasionally suffers from a few minor hiccups, it's never enough to take away from just how satisfying Bomb Rush Cyberfunk's gameplay truly is, and stands as a testament to the spirit and dedication of its development team. What Team Reptile have accomplished with Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is a contemporary homage to Jet Set Radio's legacy that is faithful, stylish, and uncompromising in its execution. While it can sometimes lack originality by wearing its heart too firmly on its sleeve, it demonstrates an unmatchable level of understanding for what made the games that inspired it so beloved. With a solid story, infectious gameplay, a banger soundtrack, and nostalgic visuals, Bomb Rush Cyberfunk is a game that's hard to put down and just as hard to stop talking about. If you're a fan of the Jet Set Radio series, then I cannot recommend this game enough. The improvements to its core formula and dedication to its attitude and style is as close as most of us thought we would get to a Jet Set Radio 3. And honestly, now that we have this game, I'm not fully convinced we need whatever Sega is cooking up anyway. The developers at Team Reptile are clearly not only passionate about the Jet Set Radio series, but are just as diehard of fans as those of us who get to play their love letter to it. Given what they've achieved with this first title, I cannot wait to see what they accomplish if given the opportunity to make Bomb Rush Cyberfunk 2. I'll probably get some flack for this, but Bomb Rush Cyberfunk was definitely my favorite game of 2023. As much as I love Tears of the Kingdom and Baldur's Gate 3, they just didn't provide that same level of fun and excitement that Bomb Rush Cyberfunk offered. It's surely going to be interesting to see how Sega handles their newly announced Jet Set Radio comeback, given just how tough the competition is now. Either way, it can't take away from what Team Reptile have accomplished here, and I hope its success leads to more fun projects from the developer. But anyway, these are just my opinions. Let me know what you thought of Bomb Rush Cyberfunk down in the comments below, leave a like, and consider subscribing. If you want to hear more of my mild gaming takes, hit me up on Twitter or Threads, and with that, I have been TheNamesJER. Thanks for watching. See you later!